100 years ago, Edward and Susan Lowe had a dream to build an English-style estate in Grand Rapids, Michigan. The result was Holmdene, an estate whose manor house today forms the crown jewel of the campus of Aquinas College. Edward Lowe came to Grand Rapids from England with his parents, James and Eliza Butterworth Lowe, in 1869. His mother's family was already established on the west side, where they helped start the plaster industry and the first iron foundry and machine shop in Grand Rapids. As a young man, Edward Lowe went to work for local lumber baron DeLoss Blodgett. Susan Blodgett, who was to become Edward's wife, was the boss's daughter, and when Edward and Susan married in 1888, they brought together two of Grand Rapids' most prestigious families. For the first 20 years of their marriage, they lived in Heritage Hill in the house now known as the Lowe-Idema House. But while living there, they laid plans for the estate that would become their home for the rest of their lives. In 1905, they purchased the McCoy Dairy Farm, located on the former Rathbun property on what were then the far outer limits of the city of Grand Rapids. Its 69 acres were traversed by two streams. The site for the manor house was selected, and the Boston architectural firm Winslow and Bigelow was hired to design the main house and the outbuildings. The house would have an elegant E-shaped footprint, with formal rooms on the first floor and family and bedrooms on the second floor. Construction of the 22-room manor began in 1906 under general contractor John McNabb and Sons of Grand Rapids. The Lowe family moved to the estate in 1908. Its name, its architectural style, and landscaping all had the feel of Edward Lowe's native England. The building was in the Tudor style, and its facade presented itself elegantly to the world. Within a few years, the ivy took hold and gave the impression that the building had been established for a long time. Little expense was spared on the elegant interior. The contractors hired workers from around the world to craft the building into a showpiece of elegance. The Tudor-style building's first floor featured a grand hall, furnished with fine sofas and a unique three-legged table. This formal entryway was dominated by the large hearth framed with an arts and crafts marble mantelpiece. Some of the German woodworkers who carved the wood trim stayed in Grand Rapids to work in the furniture industry. Off the Grand Hall was the formal dining room, with its unique plasterwork ceiling. On the west end of the first floor was the living room or parlor, Mr. Lowe's study, and Mrs. Lowe's conservatory. With this eye-catching hand-carved alabaster chandelier, its classical heads serving both decorative and functional purposes. There were stained glass windows on the doors from the library. The second floor housed the family's bedrooms, including separate rooms for Mr. and Mrs. Lowe, rooms for their three children, Edward Jr., Barbara, and James, and their nurse. The basement featured a wood-paneled billiard room. The house soon became a social center. In February 1911, Theodore Roosevelt, in town for a Lincoln Day address, stayed in one of the guest rooms on the second floor. In 1915, the house was featured as a movie set in The Blissvelt Romance, a silent film produced by the Paragon Feature Film Company of Omaha and New York, with the backing of the Grand Rapids Association, which later became the Chamber of Commerce. This melodrama, the story of a farm boy from Jenison who leaves his girlfriend and meets and finally marries into the upper crust of Grand Rapids society, was partially meant to show off such Grand Rapids landmarks as the Union Station, the bustling downtown, and the stately homes of the turn-of-the-century city. Starring some of the familiar names of Grand Rapids society, these scenes of Holmdene show that only 7 years after it was built, the house was already considered one of Grand Rapids' main architectural attractions. The manor's side patio is featured as a meeting place for the country boy and his new girlfriend. In 1922, Mrs. Lowe was finally able to indulge her passion for gardening. she hired noted New York garden designer Ellen Biddle Shipman, who designed more than 650 gardens all over the United States. The garden side of the house was undeveloped as late as 1912. However, by the time the Blissfeld Romance was made in 1915, the stairway was in place and served as the setting for the hero's proposal to his belle. Ellen Biddle Shipman installed the terracing and laid out the formal garden and incorporated such elements as the singing fountain urn on the patio. This urn was purchased by Susan Lowe around 1910 on a trip to Italy. She commissioned the piece there and asked to have the image of her youngest son, Roland, sculpted onto the marble urn. This early film footage, probably shot in the 1930s by the Lowe's son Teddy, shows the formal gardens. Mrs. Lowe took a special interest in her beloved garden, and in fact was in the garden when she suffered a fatal heart attack on the evening of August 4th, 1931. Throughout the 1930s, the home stood as a mark of elegance, getting more gracious as it aged. Son Teddy took these photos of the exterior in 1936. Following the death of Edward Lowe in 1938, his youngest son, James Rowland, was named executor of the estate. At that time, the family sold the property to the newly formed University of Grand Rapids, which occupied the buildings for only a few years before closing. During that time, Holmdene had another presidential encounter. A young University of Michigan graduate named Gerald R. Ford was hired as an assistant coach of the university's football team. In 1945, the Dominican Sisters of Grand Rapids, with the help of Michael Leonard and John E. Fry of Union Bank of Michigan, purchased the estate for $115,000 and moved Aquinas College from its downtown site. Students were enlisted to help clear the grounds, which had gone wild between the time Grand Rapids University folded and Aquinas College occupied the estate. From 1945 until 1955, Holmdene served as the main administration and classroom building for the college. In the fall of 1946, the college's new campus was formally dedicated by Bishop Haas. And for the next 10 years, Holmdene served as the college's classrooms, library, and student services building. The first floor held the library, and the upper floors were converted into classrooms. In 1955, after the college's classroom and administrative functions moved to the newly erected administration building, Holmdene became the residence for Dominican sisters who taught and worked at the college. But it remained an instantly recognizable landmark in the old photos of the campus. In 1980, Holmdene was granted historic landmark status by the Grand Rapids Historic Preservation Commission, and in 1982, after a year of renovations, Holmdene underwent another conversion, and since that time has been used for offices for administrators and faculty. The president's office was established in what used to be Mrs. Lowe's conservatory. Second-floor bedrooms were transformed into other administrative offices, and the faculty of several departments were assigned to the third floor. In the late 1970s, a surviving member of the Lowe family, Susan Quaintance Crosby Mason, granddaughter of Edward and Susan Lowe, wrote to the Dominican Sisters of Aquinas College and reminisced about visiting Holmdene during her growing up years.
We three children stayed with our nurses at Holmdene during the World War I years, as Teddy Lowe, my uncle, and John Quaintance, my father, were in Washington. As a little girl before going to France, I spent all the time I could at the farm. Mother had grown up there and was the favorite, and I followed in Mother's footsteps, taking good strainers from the long kitchen cupboard between the two kitchen doors going into the back hall to catch mud turtles down on the pond, following the old Bouters for a ride on old fat horses sowing the lawns, or at haying time to be given wild baby rabbits, or chestnut time given the most beautifully marked ones to string. Hours on, I sat by the laundry window under the back porch. I was not allowed in the dairy room, but could watch Alice making butter through the window. It was a wonderful place to grow up, and I had a very happy childhood. My room then was next to Grandfather's. I came back to live with him after grandmother died. We had a few wonderful years until he died. I still miss him. Sincerely, Susan.
As the stately Lowe mansion neared its 100th birthday, Aquinas College formed the Holmdene Restoration Committee with the leadership of Louis and Arlene Corsilia. Much-needed restoration was begun. The college also formed the Holmdene Historical Society to oversee the maintenance and tradition of this architectural landmark. Consisting of friends of the college, staff members, and alumni, the Restoration Committee and the Historical Society will see this beautiful building into its second century, with the goal of maintaining this relic of an age gone by for future generations.